Hello everyone, before we start make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching, that way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. There are cases that get solved. There are cases that get buried. And then there are cases where the solving is the burial, where the truth, once spoken aloud, becomes the very thing investigators spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The Shadowfen boys were found on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1947, on the outer edge of Harlan County, Kentucky, in a stretch of low ground the locals had always called the fen, a waterlogged depression between two hills that flooded black every time it rained. Nobody built there. Nobody farmed there. The older residents wouldn't even walk through it after dark. They said the ground had a memory. They said things that went into the fen didn't always come back the same. The boys, two of them, ages 9 and 11, were alive when they were found. That is the detail most people don't know. Most people assume this is a story about two dead children. It is not. It is something far more difficult than that. Because dead children, as devastating as they are, cannot speak. These boys could. And when they finally did, the lead detective on the case, a man named Elias Cutter, 22 years on the force, walked out of the interview room, got in his car, and didn't come back for 6 days. What they told him shattered something in the man that never healed. Elias Cutter was not a soft man. That needs to be understood before anything else. He had worked homicide in eastern Kentucky through some of the ugliest years the region had ever produced. He had processed crime scenes that would hollow out most people permanently. He had delivered death notifications to mothers, to fathers, to grandparents holding photographs of children they would never see again. He had done all of it without breaking. His colleagues described him as the kind of man who seemed to have been built specifically for the weight of other people's worst moments. Steady, quiet, almost mechanical in the way he absorbed what the world put in front of him. Which is why the 6 days matter so much. When Cutter finally returned to the precinct on that 7th morning, he looked, by all accounts, like a different person. Not disheveled. Not visibly distressed in any way you could easily name. Just altered, like something behind his eyes had been rearranged. His partner at the time, a younger deputy named Ronald Feist, would later say in a private letter that Cutter came back smelling like wood smoke and river water, as though he had been sleeping outside. He didn't explain where he'd been. He sat down at his desk, opened the case file, and said 4 words to no one in particular. "We have to go back." Nobody asked him what he meant. They were all, somehow, afraid of the answer. The boys had been reported missing 11 days before they were found. Their names were Gerald and Thomas Voss. Gerald was the older one, 11 years old, dark-haired, described by his schoolteacher as unusually serious for his age. Thomas was 9, smaller, quieter, the kind of child adults tended to overlook in a room. They had vanished on a Sunday evening in late April, last seen walking the dirt road that ran behind their family's property toward the tree line. Their mother, Nora Voss, had reported them missing within hours. Their father, a man named Harlan Voss, and yes, he shared his first name with the county, a coincidence that seemed to unsettle people who knew him, was not home when they disappeared. He would not return home for 3 days after they were found. No one ever fully explained that absence. It was noted in the file. It was never pursued. What the initial search teams found in those 11 days was almost nothing. A single shoe belonging to Thomas, recovered about 40 yards into the fen. Some disturbed ground near a cluster of black willow trees that the search dogs circled twice and then refused to approach again. And a smell. Multiple witnesses reported it independently. A smell like charred wood and something else beneath it, something organic and wrong, that searchers said seemed to move with the wind rather than come from any fixed point. The fen, as the old residents always said, had a memory. And it was not done remembering. When Gerald and Thomas were pulled from the edge of the fen that Tuesday morning, they were found by a farmer named Cecil Prout who was checking his drainage ditches after a night of heavy rain. He almost didn't see them. They were lying in the tall grass at the fen's outer boundary, side by side, on their backs, with their arms pressed flat against their bodies. Cecil would later tell investigators that his first thought was that they looked arranged. Not collapsed. Not fallen. Arranged. Like someone had placed them there with deliberate care and wanted them to be found in exactly that position. They were conscious. Their eyes were open, but neither boy spoke when Cecil approached them, and neither boy flinched when he knelt down beside them. Thomas had a laceration across his left forearm that had partially healed, meaning it was at least several days old. Gerald had lost the nail from his right index finger. There were no other visible injuries, no broken bones, no signs of significant physical trauma beyond what 11 days of exposure in wet lowland terrain would reasonably explain. What the examining physician noted privately, in handwriting so small it was almost unreadable in the case file, was something that didn't make clinical sense to him. Both boys had the same expression. Not blank, not frightened. Something he described after crossing out two other words as resolved. As though whatever had happened to them in that fun, they had already made a kind of peace with it. And that, he wrote, was the most disturbing thing he had ever documented in 30 years of medicine. The interviews didn't happen immediately. The boys were held for observation at Harlan County General for 4 days before investigators were permitted to speak with them formally. In that time, neither Gerald nor Thomas asked for their mother. Neither asked where they were. They ate when food was brought to them. They slept when the lights went down. The nursing staff reported that they never spoke to each other during those 4 days. Not once. Despite being placed in adjacent beds in the same room. And yet, on the morning of the 5th day, when a nurse arrived to find Gerald sitting upright in bed at 4 in the morning, she asked him if he was all right. He looked at her and said, quietly and without any apparent distress, "Thomas already knows what I'm going to say." Thomas was asleep in the next bed. He had not been awake. There was no way he could have heard the exchange. The nurse reported it. It was logged. It was not followed up on before the interviews began. Elias Cutter conducted both interviews himself separately on the same afternoon. He spoke to Thomas first, for 40 minutes. Then he took a 10-minute break. Witnesses say he stood in the hallway with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, and then he went in to speak with Gerald. That second interview lasted just under an hour. When it ended, Cutter walked past his deputy, past the attending physician, past the 2 state investigators who had driven down from Frankfurt specifically to observe. He walked to the parking lot. He got in his car. And he drove away. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The interview transcripts were sealed for 19 years. That is not a rumor. That is a documented administrative fact that took a Freedom of Information request filed in 1966 by a regional journalist named Paul Adcox to partially unseal. Even then, what Adcox received was incomplete. 17 pages of a reported 31-page document. The remaining 14 pages were listed as removed for reasons of ongoing investigative sensitivity. In 1966, 19 years after 2 boys were found alive in a Kentucky fawn, and no criminal charges were ever filed against anyone. What the 17 available pages revealed was this. Thomas, the younger boy, had spoken mostly in fragments during his interview. Short, declarative sentences with long silences between them. He described being inside the fun. He described darkness that he said wasn't the absence of light but something with its own presence. Something that pushed back when you moved through it. He described a structure. Not a building, he was apparently careful about that distinction. A structure, low to the ground, made of materials he couldn't name, that he and Gerald had sheltered in for some portion of their 11 days. And he described a person. Or something he called a person. An adult male, he believed, though he said the word believed with an emphasis that Cutter underlined twice in his notes. Someone who had been in the fun a long time. Someone who knew its geography with an intimacy that suggested not familiarity but residence. Someone who had spoken to both boys at length about things Thomas said he had promised not to repeat. It was Gerald's interview that broke Cutter. Because Gerald had made no such promise. Gerald repeated everything. What Gerald Voss told Elias Cutter in that room has never been fully entered into public record. What exists are fragments, second-hand accounts. A single paragraph in Paul Adcox's unpublished notes, discovered after his death in 1979, that his daughter donated to a regional archive in Lexington without fully understanding what she was handing over. That paragraph describes Gerald speaking about the man in the phone with a calm that Cutter apparently found more disturbing than any emotional breakdown could have been. Gerald did not describe violence. He did not describe captivity in any conventional sense. What he described, according to Adcox's reconstruction of the sealed testimony, was instruction. 11 days of deliberate, patient instruction. The man in the phone had taught them something, had shown them something about the nature of the ground they lived on, the families they came from, the bloodlines that ran through Harlan County like dark water through limestone. Things that were true, Gerald apparently said, that the adults in their lives had collectively and quietly agreed never to say aloud. Harlan Voss, the boy's father, left Kentucky permanently within a year of their return. Nora Voss raised Gerald and Thomas alone. Neither boy ever spoke publicly about what happened. Gerald died in 1987 at the age of 51. Thomas is, as of the last available record, still living. He has never given an interview. He has never responded to letters. He lives, by all accounts, on a plot of low ground in Western Virginia that neighbors say floods black every time it rains. Elias Cutter retired from law enforcement 8 months after the Shadowfen case closed without resolution. He moved to a small house outside of Berea, Kentucky, and spent the remaining 23 years of his life writing in private journals that his family burned after his death because, as his eldest son told a local historian in 2003, they couldn't finish reading them. They got partway through and stopped. They said the handwriting changed somewhere in the middle. They said the last entries didn't sound like their father anymore. They said it sounded like someone who had finally understood something that human beings are not supposed to understand and had kept on living anyway, which is its own particular kind of haunting. The ground remembers. And some men, once they learn what it remembers, can never quite find their way back to the surface.